Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the right side, broadcasting to you out of KGAB AM 650 and the Town Square Network serving the Intermountain West, and Easy 101 Colorado Springs serving northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and AM 780, the monster station out of Denver. Hello, Rocky Mountains, Utah to Montana, and Nebraska to Wyoming, and all the way down to New Mexico. Well, listen, folks, by popular demand, George's Ugeux back. And, you know, I'm really terrible in pronunciations, George, so you can correct me.
Don't worry.
And, you know, if you remember, George was on with us, about 6-7 weeks ago, got rave reviews from all you listeners. And we talked about international finance. To reacquaint you, he's the CEO of Galileo Global Investors, and they're an advisory investment bank. A lot of their stuff is international, and that suits George well because he basically ran 74 plus or minus banks and was a high mucky-muck in the European central banking system. And additionally, he ran the international trading floor for the New York Stock Exchange. So this is a guy who's well-versed in finance, both domestic and foreign. And a very interesting thing that came to light in the last conversation was, you know, George thinks more highly of President Obama than I do, and we had a really interesting discussion on various problems that we're facing, the economies of the world and the financial structure of the United States and the Western world. And I thought if you go back in the archives on therightsideradio.com, you ought to listen to the show. It was really quite insightful, both for George, for me, and for the listeners. But today we're going to be talking about, you know, relying heavily on George's very unique and rather illustrious experience. He just got back from a foreign trip. He's going to tell us a bit about what he saw in Europe relative to what's going on over there in terms of economy and finance, and what he saw in the Asian countries in the later part of the trip to kind of give you an international flavor of what's going on. And then we're going to turn our sights to the current scandals in the United States, not the usual crap you're hearing on mainstream media, but in terms of how it's affecting, shall we say, American stature and American economy and finance abroad. And finally, we're going to wind up where many of you have requested we wind up, and that is George is going to share with you some of the things he's doing to protect himself given the vagaries of the world economy right now and the more or less the attack on the dollar and what's happening in the United States given several different scenarios. We get our budget stuff together and we don't get our budget stuff together. So I think that, you know, from a very, very, very high-level finance person, you can take to heart what he is telling you about what you need to do to protect your assets at a household level, maybe grow your assets, although I don't think that's the first goal right now, and what to be looking for in terms of warning bells and what you might do about it. And I want to emphasize, you know, neither George nor I are giving advice. You have your own CPA, you got your own attorney, you got your own financial people. Talk to them. We're just kind of sharing with you what we think, and you can take it from there. So anyway, welcome to the show again, George.
My pleasure, Reed.
So tell us about your trip. I mean, it sounds pretty extensive, through Europe and then to Asia.
Yep, I did both, and there is something particularly fascinating. You go to Paris, and I just spent an afternoon in Versailles, the chateau, and you see something which is illustrious France, royal France, and that still exists. And then you start talking to the people, and I don't think I've ever seen them as depressed as they are now, because they don't see the way out from the crisis they are in, because they have an unenthusiastic government who is doing some of the good stuff, but they don't see where they are going, and so they start doubting about where all this is going. And since Europe is not in a good shape at the moment, they start being really concerned, and therefore you have basically a Europe in recession. And that, of course, is not a recipe for good humor or positive spirit. And they have been in recession for 3 years.
What kind of unemployment? Yeah, I know. Well, it's been very extended, and of course, you and I may disagree, but I think it's a lot to do with their social policies we talked about in the last show.
Yep.
They've spent themselves into oblivion buying votes, you know, and it's pretty tough to climb out of that hole. What kind of unemployment rates are you seeing over in Europe and the various countries right now?
Well, if you take France as a sort of middle country between the north and the south, it's about 10%. If you go to Spain, you're looking about 23%.
Wow.
And if you look at the young Spaniards, the young generation, they are at 40%. Now.
40%?
40, yes.
Wow.
So but you have to know that Spain has a certain capacity to do things without putting it in the official economy. So the number might be a little bit on the high side. But fundamentally, you have a generation who is being sacrificed by the lack of courage of their management and of their leadership, and therefore they are wondering where is all this leading to. And back to your point about Social Security and everything, we're getting at the end of it because the governments don't have the money anymore. So they also are concerned that maybe their pensions will be reduced, their Social Security allowance and whatnot are going to be reduced. They are going to lose their houses and so on. And it's really a very, very tough time for those guys.
And let me ask a question: are you seeing the same thing? You know, I mean, Spain is part of the pigs. Yeah. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Are you seeing the same thing in the other pig countries?
I don't think Italy is as bad as Spain on that front, but I have a little concern about Italy that those guys might be in denial. I don't think they realize how important their problems could be, but the system holds better than the Spanish system at the moment, the social fabric. But now the new prime minister will have to change some serious stuff.
Now, Italy kind of has a hung government right now, right?
They just had a government now, and of course it's a hung government, but to a certain extent it can do some of the right stuff because everybody knows there is no other solution. However, Prime Minister Letta just came with his new program, and his new program is going to be painful, and so what do you see? Trade unions on the street. Because that's the way Europe reacts when they see some government measures they don't like.
Well, let me ask a question, George. I mean, if you talk to somebody in the street, they know what needs to be done, however painful it's going to be.
Yeah.
I mean, do they have a realization that if they don't get it done, the pain is going to be exponential at the end of the ride?
They are afraid of that. They don't realize the amplitude of the risk, but there is something that they do. Is that I always, as we discussed last time, I always believe that the consumer, the households, are much smarter than their politicians. And when they feel the pain, they act. They start retreating. They start putting themselves in a sort of defensive mode. It doesn't help the economy, but it protects them. And you can see, whether it's in France or whether it's in Southern Europe, the people are really creating new opportunities to try to defend themselves. They are extremely defensive.
And what type of things are they doing?
For instance, what they are doing is that they are sharing clothes. They are doing all kind of stuff that you would think was not possible before. They are helping themselves because they have a great sense of family. So they have a tendency to move. And there are quite a few people who are leaving the south to go to the north. And so does, by the way, the money.
So and by the way, when you talk about the north, you're talking about Germany and the Scandinavian countries,
exactly.
Right? Okay. Now, you talked about a lack of courage in Spain and in some of the other pig countries. Explain to the audience what you mean by that, a lack of courage on the part of the government.
The problem is that, unfortunately, the kind of measures that have to be taken have to be pretty radical. And they have to navigate between another political crisis and the right thing to do. And what really strikes me is that at the European level, the differences between the countries make Europe basically ineffective. in the individual countries, it's getting better because there they take some tough measures. But for instance, just in France, the problem that they have is that they had to work another 2 years and they went on the street 5 times for that. That's not the way it should work. You should have a system where people can work later so that they make more money. You don't have a pension system in the US. In Europe, there is something, in Spain it was 57. You were starting to get your pension at 57. Now that doesn't work because people live longer and there isn't money for that.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question. Where Europe is today, would it be fair to say that if the United States does not get its act together here in the very near future, we're going to find ourselves kind of in the same predicament?
No, and there I am much more optimistic because you have 3 major differences. The employment is going down. You start to see a little down on the indebtedness. At least it's not increasing. And the economy is not in recession, and the interest rates are very low. So when you put all that together, not each element by itself, the combination of those elements make the U.S. Strong. But I had that question this morning from a French magazine, and I say, yes, part of it is the government, but more importantly, part of it is the resilience of the American people. When they see the problem, they roll up their sleeves and they do whatever they got to do. And they are not going to cry and ask for help and all those kind of things because they know that there is no sugar daddy who has the ability to rescue them. So the U.S. is much more reactive. And what you see also is gradually we're going to be much stricter on the tax side. The Apple story is not the only one, and you and I know that. We're also going to see more and more companies repatriating some jobs in the U.S. Because, at the end of the day, when you have to manage a Chinese workforce, there are also some challenges. So I have the impression that on both sides of the aisle, there is a consensus to try to make it work. It's not a political consensus. It's a practical consensus.
I'm going to disagree with you on 2 of the points you made. First, that the debt is going down or not going up. The debt is going up. The nonsense over the sequester is nothing more than a decrease in the rate of increase. And the debt continues to pile up and continues to pile up exponentially because, with our baseline budgeting system, that $1 trillion ridiculous stimulus that we did is a baked-in $1 trillion that's been in every budget since then and will be in every budget ad infinitum until we go to a zero-based budget. Additionally, the built-in increases, which are about 7% in government spending, have only gone down 2%, which means we're still increasing at 5%. So that's my first difference. My second difference is that the unemployment rates, our government lies to us. They lie to us regularly, as we're seeing with the IRS scandal, the Benghazi scandal, the AP scandal, and now Fox News. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit. But basically, Americans are getting to the point where they do not believe their government with good cause, because the unemployment rate is not 7.5%.
Yeah.
The unemployment rate is really 14.3%, and that's U6, and it's published by the Labor Department itself, although it's hidden very nicely in the statistics. And some of our unemployment rates in certain sectors, for instance, black youth or millennial people coming out of college, are in the 20 percentiles also. So, this whole thing about unemployment going down, when you have 9 million people who've left the workforce in the last 4 years, those numbers are highly skewed.
Well, the point you're making, which personally I have no evidence of, but I'm not saying you're wrong, is whether the numbers are right or wrong. Where I would also slightly disagree is you see that the household reduces, it's that you see that the government is slightly lower. There is no exponential growth at the moment. Long term is another story, but at the moment there seems to be a much better management of the debt, and we will see what is going to come from the budget, which will be the next big discussion that is going to happen, and we will, of course, disagree between what should be cut and what should not be cut.
You mean the budget we haven't had for 4 years?
Yep. Well, we used to, we still have one on paper, let's put it this way. There is a published one.
Yeah, and the one that was published by the president has been voted down 3 years in a row unanimously by both houses. In any event, I will agree with you on one thing, though, and that is America is on better footing than is Europe, but only because Europe is 20 years advanced on its giveaway programs from where the United States is right now. And I think that if we don't get our act together rather quickly, so that we do not go down the primrose path that our cousins across the sea have done. And we see the results. I mean, that's going to be the result if you don't get it under control. There is no, would you agree there's no other alternative? I mean, that's
we have no alternative. I agree entirely with you.
That's where you wind up.
Yep.
So let's switch over, and from Europe, which from basically what you're telling me, the northern countries are doing okay.
Yeah.
The southern countries are doing lousy, and it's just a degree of lousy.
Yeah, and there is no real improvement.
And the northern countries are getting damn sick and tired of supporting the southern countries, which creates stress within the Euro Union.
Yeah.
And then you went to Asia. So what did you see in Asia?
When I attended a forum in Boao, which is on an island in China, there is the Asian Summit organized by the Chinese government, and I listened to the president of China. And you know what he was saying? And the impression he gave me. First, he's going to be pragmatic. He has huge problems. By the way, just for us, the social problems and the environmental problems of Asia are monstrous. Anything we have to resolve is easy compared to what they have to do. The second thing is going to try to find a relationship with the U.S. that is on the pragmatic side. Not too much, One thing that struck everybody and was picked up, but not by the Chinese press, of course, for the reasons you know, he never, in that long speech about where China is going, how he intends to manage Asia, and so on, he didn't mention the Communist Party at all.
That's interesting.
And then the third thing is that he said very clearly, he said, look, we are not going to have hotshots in Asia threatening the growth of Asia. But what is interesting is that that's obvious, but what is interesting is that he basically said, and we, China, are not going to let it happen. So we are going to get our house together. And that was very clear for North Korea. So it's absolutely clear to me that the Chinese are doing everything they can to stop the North Korean situation. And then I flew to India, where the situation is a little bit more complicated because politics are coming. And then I went to Korea. And it's fascinating to see how Korea continues to grow, to develop, while I was in a city that was less than 100 miles from the capital of North Korea. And the people are extremely courageous, and they are acting fast. And the Japanese have also put their house together. So Asia at the moment is certainly the fastest growing area in the world. No comparison with anybody. And we have therefore three major dynamics. One is Asia, the third one is Europe, and it's in that order. But I was very interested to hear that in the economic discussions, the Chinese were not trying to go back to some of the old debates and so on. It will be very interesting to see if our government is capable of picking up what I believe is a possibility to have a slightly different relationship with China. And remember one thing, 50% of the middle class is going to be in Asia in the next 5 years. We have to realize that the world population is 7 billion, of which 4 are Asian. So time has come for us to consider that one way or another we'll have to deal with Asia, and not defensively, but in a slightly more open-minded arrangement. And they want it as well.
Let me ask a question. What would if you could advise the morons that run this government right now, if you could advise them, what 3 things would you tell them, would you recommend to them that they do for the benefit of the United States and the United States middle class, manufacturing, economy, finance, etc., what three things would you suggest they do relative to Asia right now?
The first thing is let's leave Tibet and human rights and everything in the closet. Let's talk business. We have so many interests in energy. The issue of photovoltaic, which is the sun that they can get and so on, is important to us, and it's important to them. So first, let's go down to business, and let's try to avoid all the kind of nonsense discussion. Second, let's respect them. They have done a huge job. What people don't realize is that after everything that comes from Washington, the reality is that the Chinese currency is growing vis-à-vis the dollar. So it's not that they are dumping their currency. No. Chinese products are becoming more expensive because the labor costs more and the currency is more effective. And the third one that I would say is just be totally aware that at the end of the day, if we want to avoid a next world war, it's going to be through some understanding between the U.S. and China, because the only power that the Chinese respect is the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question. What about, you hear on the back channels over here kind of this plan that Russia and China, along with India and South Africa, the BRIC countries, have hatched to kind of corner the gold market, number one, and they've been they've been huge buyers of gold. And the Chinese people respect gold. And number two, to use that gold as a solid footing for a new world currency which excludes the dollar. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't heard anything about that, because one of the misunderstandings about the gold market is the importance of jewelry. The biggest buyers of gold are women in India, in the Middle East, and in China, because they don't buy the currency, they don't buy anything else, they just buy gold. And they are getting better, they have more money, so there is a huge demand for gold as a jewelry. It is not, in my view, gold used for monetary reasons. It is gold as almost, a commodity more than something of monetary value. By the way, the Chinese don't have much gold, and they have trillions of oil-owned debt. So they are much more dependent on where the dollar is going to go than where the gold is going to go.
I have reports here I'm looking at where they bought, and it's up almost 300% from previous purchases, almost 750 billion ounces of gold, the central bank of China. 750 billion ounces of gold last year. I mean, that's a huge purchase.
I'd like to know where those numbers come from, because if I am correct, a bullion costs, an ounce costs what? Something like $1,000?
Well, right now it's about $1,400.
Okay, let's take 1,000, and 750 billion times 1,000 would be 75 trillion. The Chinese don't have that money.
750 million.
Million. That's okay.
Million.
Yeah, well, then I follow much better, because I think that what they found out, and let's be honest, they have invested heavily in dollars and in euro. It didn't give them anything good. Both currencies have been sinking. So they are now becoming much more balanced. And unfortunately, besides the yen, who went up and down, there is no real currency that is liquid enough for them to buy vast quantities. The only thing they can buy as an alternative is gold.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an investment. It's a reserve currency.
But you don't believe the reports that this is basically part of a plan to replace, to replace the American dollar with the Chinese currency as a world reserve.
You have to know one thing: the Chinese currency is not fully convertible. Okay, before we get into the point where the yuan becomes a threat to the dollar, they have to create the convertibility of the yuan, which they have not created. So we're still a long way away from finding exactly a balance between the yuan and the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
So, and since their reserves are mostly in dollars, I don't see any plot from the Chinese on that front. They are much more interested in trying to build more liquidity among the Asian currencies so that they don't depend so much on Europe and the US.
Okay, great. So bottom line is Asia is coming on strong. Europe is sinking. The United States is treading water and maybe moving forward slowly. If you want to kind of equate this as an analogy of swimmers. So that brings us to Benghazi, the IRS, and the AP scandals. Now, number one, I'm just going to ask you just very generally. I mean, I'm sure you know where I stand on this stuff, but just generally, what is your opinion of, let's say, let's start off with Benghazi. Where I really want to go, I want the audience to get a feel for what you think from your liberal standpoint, you know, the opposite of mine. But number two, very importantly, I want to wind up where we have an understanding of what these, and they're big scandals over here, what these big scandals mean internationally.
Yeah. Let's take Benghazi as an example. I have a concern, and I have to be, on that part, very clear with you. I don't know why the White House is communicating so sporadically and so unclearly. You have the Pope, our great president, who is making general statements. Once you hear the details, it doesn't fit. So I think we need a lot more transparency on this Benghazi story. Now, it's a dramatic situation. The ambassador and two people died. This is something that happens in war area. Mistakes have been made. Where I'm lost is why this becomes so important. And so there is this fixation on the Benghazi story. The IRS story is a very important one. And the reason why I consider that to be very important is because I cannot tolerate that the tax treatment between the citizens of this country and the companies of this country and the institutions, even if they are political institutions, would be dominated by political caps. Tax is a burden. Nobody likes it, but it has to be fair. Otherwise, we are going to get into a real fight between the Americans that the country doesn't need. And so, going back to your question, people abroad, do they pay a lot of attention to that? But I have to be candid because I'm going there. No, not that much. They are much more interested in issues like gun controls. They are much more interested in the Oklahoma problems. They are much more interested in things that are very concrete about the life of the U.S. And these kind of things are not at the moment threatening the image of the U.S., partly because the U.S. is doing economically reasonably well. And therefore, people have a tendency to consider rather positively the United States.
You mentioned gun control. So what's the international flavor on the gun control issue?
Well, on the gun controls, because, I mean, I've never had a gun. We never have guns in Europe. I mean, they are hunting people, and then you have a few people who are doing that, but guns are not part of our culture. You go to China, there is no gun. I mean, it's the same everywhere. So there is a sort of disbelief on saying, why on earth is this so important when it comes to war weapons, you know, the very offensive one? That the guy wants to have a gun and he wants to exercise and so on. It's fine. But then this is something where we say this is part of the history of the U.S. And in that sense, while everybody would like to see less guns, the reality is that it is not something that really is critical in the opinion of the rest of the world of the U.S., but it is very visible, so it makes headlines, you know. Mm-hmm. And the vote on that was followed very closely and everything. That's the kind of thing. But at the moment, when you go to Europe, certainly, and in Asia, there are still a lot of people who would love to have a lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, on Benghazi, I think the importance of Benghazi, and listen, as tragic as the loss of 4 lives were, and
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, everybody understands this was a dangerous zone, but I think what's elevated this story is it is not no longer a story about Benghazi
That's correct.
and an attack on a consulate. It is a story about whether or not you can believe the government.
Exactly.
You know, and that is what has elevated, and you know, there's still many answers to come. I mean, who issued these 2 stand-down orders to the relief folks that were loaded on a plane ready to fly in there and help? And, you know, where did this video nonsense come from? And who had the power to change these talking points 12 times from the CIA and then hide it and deny it from the American people until it leaked out?
Yep.
I mean, these are huge issues, and they have really, Benghazi is just the visual symbol, but the reality is it is a fracturing of confidence in the administration and whether or not they are lying, number one. And number two, if they're lying to us about this, which should be pretty well black and white. I mean, if you made a mistake, you made a mistake.
Yeah, just admit it.
But if you're lying about this, what else are you lying to us about?
Exactly.
And then right on its heels, of course, you get the IRS. And now today, you know, just in the last few days, that story is changing again. We didn't know until we read the newspaper reports. Now suddenly the White House did know, but we didn't tell the president. Now, you know, I mean, this stretches credibility. I mean,
I agree with that, and I think we don't realize how damaging it is for a country when the average people don't believe in their Congress, don't believe in their president, don't believe in their government. Because I think trust is absolutely essential, because this country has a huge responsibility vis-à-vis the world, and it needs to be able to count on the support of its population. And at the moment, there is a deficit. And that's what I was telling in the beginning. Why does the White House continue to play those kind of communication games? Why not be candid? Why not come back and say, you know what? We don't know what's happened. We'll come back to you tomorrow when we found the facts.
Well,
and then when you come with the
they've been
facts,
saying that for 8 months on Benghazi.
Exactly. And the version varied for 8 months. So this is certainly something that I personally don't agree with at all. I don't think you can treat the American people, or any nation for that matter, like that.
I would agree, but I think particularly the Americans, because, you know, this is the only representative republic on the face of the earth.
Exactly.
And although the Europeans don't really understand it, the gun culture is not really a gun culture. It is a freedom culture.
Exactly.
You know, yes, there's people who have guns because they, you know, want to be macho and whatever. I mean, whatever. There's people who drive big cars for the same reason over in Europe. I mean, there's no difference. But the reality is that the gun culture, if you want to call it that over here, is the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment came from, and this is a very short time ago in terms of world history, 230 years ago, that Second Amendment was put in place to make sure a government did not get out of control. And there's a perception over here, particularly as these lies continue to pile up. I mean, you can go back prior to these 3 scandals and talk about health care. And you and I talked about it last time in terms of, you know, whether it was good or bad. But in terms of lies, I mean, the American people were told it would cost $900 billion. It's now $2.7 trillion. They were told they could keep their doctor. Now the IRS itself, not that you can trust them, comes out with a report that 7 to 9 million people are going to lose their policies. You know, they promised that premiums would go down $2,500. They've doubled for everybody. They promised that there'd be no taxes. The exact words were, not one dime. If you made under $250,000, everybody who got a paycheck on January 15th saw that their paycheck was less because the middle class is getting taxed. Yeah. I mean, you know, this is a cumulative effect of mistrust.
And I think that is That is undemocratic.
Yes, it is.
And that
Very.
is where the issue is. We are very proud of our democracy, but when we behave, the government or Congress or whoever behaves that way, it's democracy that you're attacking.
That's exactly right. I happen to agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. Let's talk about the third one, the AP, which is now expanded. Now we're finding out more. Now they've been after other news organizations, some folks at Fox News, etc. What do you think about what do you think about a government that goes out and gets reporters' phone records so that they can chill leaks in their own government, which are exposing their previous lies? I mean, this whole thing kind of ties in.
Yeah, the whole thing ties in. But I know I will disappoint you, but I'm going to be totally cynical. I have still to find a government that doesn't do that one way or another, anywhere in the world. I mean, the whole issue, and you remember we had that with the Bush administration, whether you need to have a court judgment or not a court judgment or whatever. The whole issue is that the politicians and the power is trying to find out desperately what is coming ahead, and they are managing on both sides pretty much, more the media than they are actually managing the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And they should spend more importance and attach more importance to the country than they should about their image and everything. But politicians live off their own image, but it's not good. And so in that sense, I am totally against it. But at the same time, I have to recognize that it's so frequent that, let's put it this way, was anybody really surprised here?
Yeah, actually, I was surprised.
Okay.
I mean, let me put it this way. The lengths to which the current administration will go to solidify and protect its political base and attack its political enemies to increase its power, I put no bounds on that. But the fact that they would have the balls to go out and attack the AP, which is really kind of a administration supporter.
Yeah, that's the worst.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of shows you just how low they will go and how paranoid they are.
I understand.
I could almost understand it. Don't misunderstand me. I would not condone it at all. I would understand if they had done it to Fox News. but it's true. But to do it,
I understand what you say, but basically they should do to no journalist. Period.
I mean, the chairman of the AP introduced Obama. I mean, it sounded like he was married to the guy 3 months ago at a dinner.
Amazing.
So, in any event, you and I agree. I mean, none of these things are good. Cumulatively, they're very bad. And I think, and tell me what let's go one step further. If you get the American people pissed off, and you get them to the point where they don't believe you, what's going to happen is that the current, shall we say, tug of war in Washington, where little can get done to improve the economy or take the steps in Asia that you're talking about, it's just going to get exponentially more glacial. I mean, it's just not going to move.
Exactly, and that means, and in the November elections, we might see quite a few of bozos being elected just because...
Exactly. Let's talk about, given what you've seen in the world, what your views, which are slightly different than mine, although not in terms of problems and solutions, in the United States are. Here's the folks that are listening to us. You're talking to people in 7 Western states, and I think we're getting 50 or 60,000 downloads a month right now from all across the country on the radio site, on the rightsideradio.com. What would you, George, recommend if you were a middle-class household? You are a couple, or you're a couple with 1 or 2 kids. One of you is working, or both of you are working. You're a little concerned about your job. Your house is still it's getting better, but it's still underwater. You're having difficulty making ends meet with the increase in taxes and healthcare costs. And you have this unsettling feeling because of all the things we've talked about thus far that something really isn't right. What would you suggest to these folks to protect their assets?
I would make a difference between the young generation and the generation who, is going to retire soon or has retired. For that generation, I would say, remember one thing, the only thing that saves you is a cash flow. So, where is the cash flow going to come from? Yes, there is some pension, but you and I know that you cannot live on pension. You need more than that. So you have to look at how much you spend and figure out whether you can maintain it. I made that calculation for myself. I don't know how long I'm going to live, but there are a lot of people who are living until 90, so I need to have a cash flow until I'm 90 and even over. And I have taken some pretty drastic measures myself to reduce my exposure so that I'm in a situation where I improve my cash flow. So for those people, it's really streamlining and make sure you're not overexposed, because it's not going to get better for the pensioners.
Right.
And in a situation like we have at the moment, where we have basically zero interest rates, it's even worse. Because how much money do you need to make $100,000? You know, it used to be $1 million, now it's 10 million. And that is a pretty dangerous situation.
And by the way, folks, what George is talking about is if you put your money in a bank and get interest on it, with the low interest rates today, you'd need $10 million to make $100,000 interest at 1%.
Yep.
Whereas, let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, you could have $1 million and make $100,000 a year on interest.
Exactly. And therefore, we have to consider that this is a very important moment for those families who have done the best for their children, have lent them to school, did whatever they want, to think about their own well-being and focus on the cash flow. And there, the issue is liquidity, because real estate doesn't produce a lot of money, and that money is stuck. So be liquid, be prudent, and look at your cash flow. Now, when you talk about the young generation, you have to build wealth. Because to a certain extent, my generation has been able to benefit from 30 pretty good years in terms of everybody becoming wealthy, having money, and so on and so forth. That's gone. That's not going to come back. We're not going to see the kind of growth and development that we have seen. And for them, therefore, building wealth is going to be a major objective so that they can then look at the cash flow when they are getting later. And that's where the difference is. But at the end of the day, I think you have to be conservative today. Don't dream. We have been through the dreams. The whole thing blew up in 2008. We've lost our illusions. We've had families and kids living in cars because their houses were out and things like that. We should never have that again. So we need to prepare for the next one and be very, very careful about how we spend and how we try to get some revenues.
So let me ask a question. You know, talking about, we'll say, the retirement generation, people, who are nearing retirement, let's say 55 and above.
Yeah.
So, let's assume that they don't have enough put away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just math, What types of things would you recommend? First of all, would you agree with me that the most important thing right now is to preserve capital?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, you forget making the big profits and the killings. I'm not talking about the younger set. I'm not talking about the younger set.
You need to keep your capital stable and try to maximize the revenue you get from it and protect it. It's not the time to go into hedge funds, in derivative products, on all kind of innovative things. It is time to look at very classical ways of protecting your capital.
So, for that generation, the older generation, give them 3 things that they could think about or 4 things they could think about in terms of, putting their capital in a relatively safe place where the capital will be preserved and they can make, without risk, the most income, even if it's not much.
The first thing is, as much as you can, get out of credit cards. Because at the rates, outrageous rate that the banks are making on credit cards, it eats your capital alive before you even realize it. Because if you have to pay 10, 15, or 20% on your credit card, that's money that's gone through the window. So first thing, be sure you're not overexposed on credit cards. Try to find a refinancing, get some additional loans or whatever, but get out of the trap of credit cards. Credit cards are bad. The second one is to protect your capital, have a piece of real estate, but not as an investment, but to create the stability of your livelihood so that you can stay and die in your home, which is a very important objective for people. Don't think that you are going to do masterfully there, but at least nobody's going to be able to throw you out. So be sure that you're not overfinanced there, but have a piece of real estate. And the third one is really look at the possibility to look at stable assets and look at yield. And what I mean by that is, no, it doesn't give much money. No, the treasury bonds are not giving much money, but it protects your capital. So this is a tough period, but we know inflation is going to come back one day or another, and interest rates are going to go up. If that happens, there is a risk that your equity will go through the window because the value of your more speculative assets is going to drop. And so if you do those three things, you should not be put in a situation where you have a tornado. It doesn't mean you are going to have an easy life, but at least it is predictable and safe.
Gotcha. Now, let's talk about the younger generation. What 3 or 4 things would you recommend for, let's say, the 25-year-old, give or take, high school or college graduate? Right now, they may have a low-paying job. Maybe they're not employed, or perhaps they have a degree and they're at the lower end, lower rung of a ladder on, trying to work their way up a corporate ladder, which, as we both know, is rather unsure today.
The first thing I would say is be aware that you are at the most productive part of your life in terms of the kind of salaries that they will pay. Once you'll get into 55, you might lose your job, you might have all kind of stuff. So for you, it's not retention of capital, it's accumulation of capital. So you can have a growth strategy, and one of the ways to have a growth strategy is to secure also your home. So you go back to the point I was making even for the retirees. Be sure you have a place that nobody can take away from you. That's the first thing. The second thing, in order to accumulate, you can go into great companies and buy stocks and so on of great companies that grow with the economy, that do the right thing and so on. Be very ethical in your investments. Don't trust people who are telling you that tomorrow you're going to do 40% without risk. It doesn't exist. And the third one is make sure you don't get used to too many unnecessary spendings that could lead you at one stage not to have enough money for your retirement. Don't necessarily go buy an expensive car or take huge vacation for thousands of dollars and things like that. Be sober, not savvy, but sober on your spending side. If you do those three things, you are going to end up at 55, having accumulated capital, having your home, and having be used to a standard of living that you can continue. Nobody wants to reduce their standard of living.
So, let's take that second recommendation you made for the younger set. You were talking about, stocks or bonds or, those equity investments.
Yeah.
Would you agree with me? First of all, I'll tell you, I'm not a big stock fan. I'm not a big fan of somebody having my money and the price of it is predicated upon how good a cup of coffee they had in New York on Monday. Mm-hmm. That just doesn't do much for me. But I know that many people do like stocks. So if you were talking about stocks, would you agree that the safest course of action, because once again, if you're accumulating capital and you're younger, you also want to be preserving the capital as you accumulate it. You don't want to be subjecting it to a lot
That's
of
why
risk.
you don't want to go to Facebook at 2,200 times earnings.
Exactly. So what people need to do is they need to look at these big kind of world generator type companies. You know,
Correct.
the IBMs and the Coca-Colas and you know,
Even the
companies
Gs, absolutely.
right, and the companies that pay dividends, they're
Exactly.
stable, their price-earnings ratio are low. I mean, in other words, people need to do some research before they buy stock.
Oh, yes. And if they don't feel comfortable doing it, you know what? Go to not a small shop, but go to one of the very respectable money managers and buy a fund that is oriented toward growth and is diversified, so you're not subject to one stock going one way or another, and try to go into those mutual funds gradually if you don't want to do the research. But if you don't want to go into mutual funds, I follow you entirely, Reed. Do your homework.
You betcha. Now, let me ask a question for both the older and the younger set. What about energy-related investments?
I think the energy is going to be, no matter what, the essential element that we need. There are two ways to play the energy. The first one is to play the utilities. And the utilities have an advantage. They generally give good dividends. But they are like a bond. They are completely boring. But if you believe that the Exxons of this world are really going to go into alternative energy, they are really going to play the energy game and just not try to make the money that they are making at the moment and really invest in the future, I would go to some of the diversified, the people who are not just in oil, but also in gas, in alternative energy and things like that. And I think that the oil companies are learning that message now. And just, again, do your research, find out where they get their oil from. It might not be the best to invest in a company that has its oil from the Middle East, because this is a very difficult area at the moment, but there are some great companies. And I would just add one element that is very unusual. Look at Canada.
Yep.
Canada has sorted out its pension problem. Canada is a very respectable country. They have real values. And guess what? They have hydro resources. Canada is going to make it possible for New York to have power, and it's going to come from water. They have biomass. They have shale gas. They have oil. They have everything. And it might be more interesting at this stage to invest in Hydro-Quebec or people like that in Canada than in the U.S. But I'm not trying not to be a good citizen here. I'm just saying, remember Canada, because it's a pretty fascinating and very good country.
Not only have they kind of sorted out some of their social problems and reversed the course they've been on, not only do they have these resources, but they are a global player in those resources. They don't have the politics going on here, and they don't have the defense budget because they're under our defense umbrella.
Yeah, and they have their own army, but it's not exactly the same thing. They don't need to be a nuclear power.
Exactly. So I think that is great. Great advice, and that also ties in with what you talked about at the beginning of the show, because if you look for energy sectors that not only are going to feed the United States, whether they're from the United States or Canada, but that also have a global reach to Asia, which obviously is the growth area of the world over the next 10, 20 years, then I think you kind of got all sorts of things going for you.
Yep. And there I would be very careful in the sense I would be diversified and I would have a fund, because I can tell you from my experience, because I do that for a living, research on Chinese or Indian companies is sometimes an exercise in futility because you don't know if you can trust the numbers.
Yeah, I'm not so much saying invest in Indian or Chinese companies. I'm talking about American or Canadian companies which will be feeding those markets.
Oh yeah. But I would like to say something. Don't rush, because for the moment the Dow Jones is at a level that is only explainable by the quantitative easing of the Federal Reserve, which is going to last one day.
Right.
So go back to the market when the Q is out. for the moment, it's like, giving you an injection every day to stand up.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, and we agree completely on this is a really artificial bubble.
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, listen, as always, it has been absolutely terrific. I hope folks got a lot, particularly out of this last third, and the first two thirds were extremely interesting, as always. We're going to have you back again in a couple months, and we'll see how our prognostications have gone. We'll see how these scandals sort out. We'll see if Europe, Southern Europe, manages to dig itself out of the hole and get some cojones. And we'll see what the American people are thinking at that time, and we can talk about what's going to be going on for the next 6 months from our various perspectives.
With great pleasure, Reed. You know that.
Great pleasure, George. Thank you very much. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the right side, folks, and a great interview. I really like this guy, even though we are on different ends of the political spectrum. And I think he had some great sage advice for you. Fascinating discussion of Europe and Asia and where the growth of the future is going to be, and our varying viewpoints on where America is right now. And you just listened to one of the great minds on the planet in terms of finance. So I hope that the general ideas he gave you, once again, check with your own people. I mean, don't take our word for it or George's word for it, but he gave you some great general mapping there. And you ought to think about it very seriously. Because in the end, we all want to be happy, we all want to be healthy, we all want to be free. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the right side out of KGAB, AM 650 Cheyenne, and the Intermountain network of the Town Square radio stations, and Easy 101 Colorado Springs, and AM 780 Denver. Until next Saturday, stay happy, stay healthy, and according to George, stay wealthy.
For more information about Reed and his work, please go to ontherightsideradio.com. There you can also click to purchase the first 2 volumes of his #1 best-selling historical Western series, Threads West, An American Saga, and Maps of Fate. And now the first volume of his new nonfiction series, Land for Love and Money, is available everywhere, or go to landforloveandmoney.com. That's Land for Love and Money. We'd also like to remind you that if you've missed any shows, you can go to the show archives on Reed's ontherightsideradio.com webpage. We look forward to seeing you again next week for another episode of Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.